My name is Maren Voss, and I am 35 years old. The first time I saw my mother in handcuffs, I was sitting on my own living room couch in Burlington, Vermont, holding my newborn daughter against my chest while the police read Celeste Holloway her rights beside the same fireplace where she had smiled for baby shower photos 2 hours earlier. Juniper was so small her whole body fit between my elbow and my palm. She made soft, uneven little sounds against the blanket, still new to the world, still unaware that the woman crying in the doorway had once called herself her grandmother. Celeste kept looking at me like I had betrayed her. Not like she had come into my home, carrying a manila folder full of accusations. Not like she had stood in front of my friends, my neighbors, my husband's aunt, and tried to make me look cruel for protecting something that belonged to my child. Not like she had planned to turn my baby shower into a public trial. She looked wounded, offended, almost holy in her outrage. That was always my mother's gift. She could hold a match, smell the smoke, and still convince half the room that she was the one being burned. What she wanted that day was simple. The Voss family sapphires, worth $312,000, promised to Juniper before she was even born. What she exposed instead was something much bigger. A secret hidden under church receipts, forged signatures, and years of fake sacrifice. She thought she was going to break me in front of everyone. But Celeste forgot one thing. My husband had cameras in the house. And for the first time in my life, I let my mother keep talking. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 38% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. To understand why I let my mother keep talking that afternoon, you have to understand that Celeste Holloway had been teaching me who I was to her long before I had the language to name it. I was 17 the first time I understood that my mother did not measure love in tenderness. She measured it in usefulness. That summer, I worked the closing shift at a small pharmacy on North Avenue. I stocked shelves, cleaned the counter glass, counted change for tired customers, and came home smelling like floor cleaner and receipt paper. I was saving for a used laptop for college. Nothing fancy, just something that would not freeze every time I opened more than 2 tabs. My first paycheck was $412.86. I remember the exact number, because I wrote it in blue ink on the back of the envelope. Like seeing it there made me real. Like I had earned a small piece of my future with my own hands. When I came home that night, Celeste was sitting at the kitchen table with her pearl necklace resting perfectly against her collarbone. She had a cup of tea beside her, and the electric bill laid flat in front of her. She touched one pearl between her thumb and forefinger, the way she always did before making something selfish sound reasonable. "Since you're earning now," she said, tapping the bill with one fingernail, "you can start learning what it means to contribute." She didn't ask how my shift went. She didn't ask if my feet hurt. She didn't ask what I was saving for. In her mind, the money had become family money, the second she knew it existed. I looked toward the hallway, where my father was folding towels near the laundry room. For one second, I thought Nolan might step in. He knew I had been saving. He knew Piper had spent that same afternoon at the mall, posting pictures of iced coffee, shopping bags, and a new pair of boots she claimed were a little treat. But my father only looked at the floor. "Just give her the money, Maren," he said softly. "It's easier than turning this into a fight." 2 weeks later, Piper backed Celeste's sedan into a mailbox while texting. The repair cost $389. Celeste called it an accident, kissed Piper's forehead, and told her not to cry. I found out where the money came from when I opened the little cash box under my bed and saw nothing inside but the folded receipt from the repair shop. When I confronted Celeste, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look embarrassed. "Your sister was devastated," she said. "You're stronger than she is." That was the first time I understood what strength meant in my family. It did not mean respect. It meant permission to take more from me. For years after that, I told myself adulthood would give me distance. I thought if I married, paid my own bills, built my own home, and stopped needing anything from my mother, Celeste would finally have no reason to pull at me. By the time I married Graham Voss and moved into our little house in Burlington, I wanted to believe I had outgrown the old rules of the Holloway family. I was wrong. My mother simply found new doors to open. At first, the intrusions were small enough that complaining about them made me sound petty. She would come over for Sunday lunch and wander through our kitchen while I was still setting the table, opening cabinet doors as if she had misplaced something in a house she had never lived in. She checked the brand of coffee we bought, lifted the lid on the sugar jar, ran one finger along the edge of our stove, and smiled when she found nothing to criticize. "Just seeing how you keep things," she would say. When Graham's restoration business started taking bigger jobs, Celeste shifted her attention to him. She asked how much insurance companies paid on storm damage contracts. She asked whether homeowners gave deposits up front. She asked if his business account was separate from our personal savings. Graham answered politely at first, because he had been raised to respect mothers, even difficult ones. But after one dinner, when Celeste asked whether his Aunt Beatrice had family money or real money, Graham went quiet in a way I had learned to recognize. Later, while we loaded the dishwasher, he said, "Your mother doesn't ask questions, she takes inventory." I wanted to defend her, not because he was wrong, but because admitting he was right made the room feel colder. When I got pregnant, Celeste's curiosity sharpened. She wanted to see the nursery before the paint had dried. She picked up the tiny yellow sweater Graham had folded into the dresser and checked the tag. She asked what stroller we planned to buy, whether Beatrice was helping, whether the baby would be on Graham's insurance, whether we had started a college fund. Then one afternoon, while I was making tea, she stopped outside our bedroom and said, too casually, "Where are you keeping the Voss sapphires?" I turned from the stove. "Why?" She touched the pearls at her throat. "Don't be suspicious, Maren. A mother is allowed to be curious. But curiosity has warmth in it. My mother's questions had edges." When I mentioned it to Nolan, he gave the same tired sigh I had heard since childhood. She just wants to feel included. But Graham heard something else. So did I. Celeste was not trying to be included in our life. She was trying to find the lock before she ever admitted she wanted the key. The Voss sapphires became real to my mother the day Beatrice brought over the appraisal papers. It was a rainy Thursday in late July, the kind of rain that made the windows look blurred at the edges. Graham's aunt arrived with a canvas tote bag tucked under one arm, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, her raincoat dripping onto our entry rug. Beatrice Voss had the kind of calm presence that made people lower their voices without realizing they were doing it. For decades, she had managed the family records. Deeds, insurance policies, old photographs, trust documents, and the quiet paper trail of people who believed legacies should be protected, not performed. She sat with us at the dining room table and opened a cream-colored folder. Inside were photographs of the sapphire necklace, the matching ring, and a small antique brooch shaped like a spray of leaves. The stones were a deep blue, almost midnight under the light, set in old white gold that had belonged to Graham's grandmother and her mother before that. "The last formal appraisal came in at $312,000, Beatrice said. "But that number is not the point." Then she looked at my belly, not at the jewelry. "This belongs to Juniper when she is old enough to understand what it means. Until then, you and Graham are only the guardians." Guardians. I remember how that word settled in me. Not owners, not spenders, not people allowed to trade a child's inheritance for someone else's emergency. 2 nights later, Celeste came for Sunday dinner with Piper and Nolan. I had not told her about the appraisal. I never found out who did. In my mother's world, money had a smell, and she always followed it. Halfway through dessert, Celeste set down her fork and touched the pearls at her throat. "So," she said, smiling lightly, "I hear Graham's family has decided your unborn baby needs jewelry." Graham's hand went still beside his coffee cup. "It's a family heirloom," I said. "It will be kept safe for her." Celeste gave a soft laugh, the kind meant to make everyone else feel unreasonable. A child who has not even been born yet does not need a $300,000 necklace, Maren. Your sister is about to lose her apartment. Piper looked down right on cue, dabbing at eyes that were not wet. She said clients had delayed payments, vendors had cheated her, and life had been unfair. Celeste leaned toward me. Family helps family. Blood matters more than stones. There it was. Not greed. Not entitlement. A sermon. I looked at Nolan, waiting for one sentence. He cut his pie into smaller pieces and said nothing. That night, I understood. My mother had found her excuse. She would turn protection into selfishness, and she would make sure other people heard her say it. She did not ask for the sapphires again that night. That would have been too honest, and honesty was never my mother's favorite weapon. Celeste worked better in shadows, in comments dropped softly enough that she could later deny the damage. It started the next morning in the Holloway family group chat. There were cousins in that chat I barely saw, an aunt in Rutland, Piper, Nolan, and my mother, who could turn a holiday photo or a casserole recipe into a reminder of what kind of daughter I was becoming. At 8:17 a.m., while I was getting ready for work, Celeste sent a message with no name attached. Some people forget the hands that raised them once they marry into comfort. I stared at it with toothpaste still sharp on my tongue. No one replied for a few minutes. Then Aunt Lorna sent a sad face emoji. A cousin wrote, "Hope everything is okay." Piper followed with, "It's just hard when family stops caring." I put the phone face down on the bathroom counter. That was the trick. Celeste never had to accuse me directly. She only had to build a room where everyone assumed I was guilty before I walked into it. By lunch, Piper had posted a photo of herself at a downtown cafe, mascara smudged just enough to look accidental. The caption read, "Sometimes the people with the most have the coldest hearts." She never mentioned my name, or the sapphires, but people understood exactly what she wanted them to understand. That Sunday, Celeste carried the story into church. Not loudly. Never loudly. She stood near the coffee urn after service, one hand around a paper cup, pearls resting against her throat, and told Mrs. Whitaker she was praying for a spirit of generosity in the family. She told Deacon Paul that pregnancy had made me protective in a way that worried her. She told another woman that Piper was facing housing trouble, but that some people guard jewels more carefully than they guard their sister. By the time Graham and I stopped by the church office for a routine parish form, 3 people looked at my belly before they looked at my face. That hurt more than I wanted to admit, because I had spent my life trying to be fair, trying to be kind, trying to be the daughter no one could accuse of selfishness. That evening, Graham found me in the nursery, holding one tiny sock in my hand, and staring at the crib he had built. He came up behind me and said, "You know this isn't about Piper's apartment." I nodded. For the first time, I understood that my mother did not just want the sapphires. She wanted witnesses. The first crack in my mother's story did not arrive with shouting. It arrived in a white envelope, folded neatly between a grocery flyer and the water bill. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the church whispers started following me around like a second shadow. I had come home early from the hospital because my ankles were swollen, and Dr. Moreno had told me, kindly but firmly, that being 36 weeks pregnant was not the time to prove I could still do everything. I made myself sit at the kitchen table before opening the mail. That had become a small rule in our house. No standing over the trash can sorting bills while exhausted. No pretending rest was laziness. Graham had started that rule after he found me folding baby clothes at midnight with tears running down my face, not because I was sad exactly, but because my body was tired, in a way pride could not fix. The envelope was from Street Agnes Community Outreach. At first, I thought it was another church notice or some reminder about the baby shower donation table. Then I opened it and read the first line. "Dear Mrs. Voss, thank you for your continued generosity and your recent contribution of $12,500. I stared at the number so long it seemed to lift off the page. $12,500. I had not donated $12,500 to anyone. Graham and I were comfortable, but we were not careless. We had medical bills coming, nursery expenses, insurance deductibles, and a baby due any week. A gift that large would have been a conversation, not an accident. I read the letter again. Then again. The signature at the bottom belonged to the outreach director, Mrs. Elaine Porter, a soft-spoken woman with silver glasses who always remembered people's birthdays. My hands had gone cold. I called the number printed on the letter. Elaine answered on the third ring, cheerful at first, then uncertain when I asked about the contribution. "Oh," she said, papers rustling in the background. "Yes, this is part of the Holloway Family Assistance Fund paperwork. Your mother handled the forms, but your name is listed as the confirming donor." My mother handled what forms? There was a pause. "I'm sorry, Maren. I thought you knew." Something quiet moved through me then. Not panic. Recognition. I asked Elaine to send me copies of everything with my name on it. She hesitated, then agreed when I told her plainly that I had not signed anything. When I hung up, the kitchen felt too still. I looked at the letter, at my married name printed in clean black ink, and understood that Celeste had not only been turning people against me, she had been using me, not as a daughter, not even as a witness, as a cover. I did not call my mother. That was the first important decision I made, and it went against every instinct Celeste had trained into me. For most of my life, if something felt wrong, I went to her first. I asked for an explanation. I gave her a chance to soften the truth, bend it, dress it up in sacrifice, and hand it back to me as something I should feel guilty for questioning. This time, I folded the letter from Street Agnes Outreach back into its envelope and called Beatrice. She answered on the second ring. I told her what the letter said. I told her Elaine Porter was sending copies. Beatrice did not gasp or fill the silence with outrage. She listened the way careful people listen when they understand that panic can ruin evidence. When I finished, she said, "I'm giving you Hadley Quinn's number. Call her before you speak to anyone in your family." Hadley's office was above a bookstore on Church Street, but she agreed to meet me by video that evening because Dr. Moreno had me limiting unnecessary trips. She had short dark hair, reading glasses on a silver chain, and the kind of face that did not waste expressions. I held the letter up to the laptop camera. Hadley read it without interrupting. Then she asked me to forward every email from Elaine, save every text from Celeste and Piper, and write down dates while they were still fresh. "Do not accuse your mother yet," she said. My throat tightened. "So I just let her keep lying?" "No," Hadley said. "You stop reacting, and you start documenting." The next morning, Elaine sent the first set of scanned forms. I opened them at the kitchen table with Graham standing behind my chair, one hand resting on my shoulder. There was my name, Maren Holloway Voss, typed cleanly beneath a donor certification statement I had never seen. Under it was a signature shaped almost like mine, but too round in the M, too heavy at the end of Voss. Someone had practiced. Someone had gotten close. But it was not mine. There were 3 more forms attached, different dates, different amounts, each one connected to temporary assistance payouts that had moved through accounts tied to Piper's event business. Graham exhaled once. Hard. I didn't. I just kept scrolling. That was what frightened me most about myself in that moment. I was not shocked. I was not even confused. Somewhere deep down, some quiet part of me had been expecting to find my mother's hands under the floorboards of every disaster she claimed had simply happened. I looked at Graham and said, "She didn't just lie about me." My voice sounded distant, almost clinical. "She used my name to lie to everyone else." Hadley did not let the silence sit for long. On the screen, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Maren, listen carefully. Your mother thinks she is controlling the story because people are repeating it. That makes her confident. Confident people talk too much." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in me. "You're telling me not to stop her. I'm telling you not to rescue her from her own mouth." That sentence stayed with me. For 35 years, I had been trained to interrupt disaster before it embarrassed my mother. Smooth it over. Explain her tone. Translate cruelty into concern. Pretend her sharpness was stress, her greed was worry, her lies were misunderstandings. Hadley was asking me to do something that felt unnatural in my bones. Let Celeste be Celeste. She gave us a list before the call ended. Save the group chat. Screenshot Piper's posts before they disappeared. Keep the church letter in a plastic sleeve. Ask Elaine for certified copies, not just scans. Do not discuss the forged signatures over text with anyone connected to the Holloway family. Do not move the sapphires without a record of where they went. And above all, if Celeste tried to create a public confrontation, do not argue the facts in the room. Let the room become evidence, Hadley said. After the call, Graham walked through the house without speaking much. He checked the small camera above the back entry, the one angled toward the kitchen. He checked the living room camera we had installed after a contractor's trailer was stolen from one of his job sites. He checked the cloud backup, the timestamps, the audio. Rambut! This was Graham's way of being afraid. He became practical. I stood in the hallway with one hand on my belly, feeling Juniper shift slowly under my ribs, and realized I was not just preparing to prove my mother wrong. I was preparing to protect my daughter from inheriting the same confusion I had lived inside. The next morning, I called Marisol Vega. Marisol had been a labor and delivery nurse for 15 years before moving into patient education, and she had the kind of calm that made emergencies feel smaller. I told her enough. Not everything, but enough for her to understand that the baby shower might not stay peaceful. She didn't ask dramatic questions. She only said, "Tell me where you want me to stand." That nearly broke me. Not because it was grand, because it was simple. Because for once, someone did not ask me to prove I deserved protection before offering it. By Friday night, the sapphires were no longer in the house. The original appraisal was with Beatrice. Copies were with Hadley. Graham had backed up every camera twice. And I had done the hardest thing of all. I had stopped warning my mother where the floor ended. Saturday morning arrived too bright for what I knew was coming. The sky over Burlington was clean and blue, the kind of September sky that made people open windows and believe, for a few hours, that nothing terrible could happen. Graham had strung soft white lights along the back porch before breakfast. Marisol arrived early with a tray of lemon bars and a look on her face that told me she had slept less than she would admit. Beatrice came 20 minutes later carrying hydrangeas in a glass vase, pale blue and cream, the exact colors Graham had painted in Juniper's nursery. For anyone else, it would have looked like a beautiful baby shower. The dining table was covered with a linen cloth. There were tiny folded cards where guests could write wishes for the baby. A vanilla cake with lemon filling sat in the center of the kitchen island. Graham had built a little wooden cradle for cards and gift envelopes, sanding it until the edges felt smooth under my fingers. I kept touching ordinary things that morning, like they could keep me anchored. The ribbon on a favor bag, the cool glass of the lemonade pitcher, the small gold bracelet Graham had given me when we first heard Juniper's heartbeat. But beneath every sweet detail was another layer no one could see. The real sapphires were already in a bank deposit box under Beatrice's name and mine. The original appraisal was not in the house. Hadley had digital copies of the church documents, the forged forms, Piper's posts, the group chat, and the security camera settings. The small velvet case in our bedroom drawer held nothing but a folded note Graham had written in his careful block letters. "This belongs to Juniper, not to guilt, not to debt, not to anyone who calls greed love." I did not know if Celeste would go looking for it. I only knew my mother rarely came into a room without searching for what could be taken. Guests began arriving a little after noon. Neighbors, a few of Graham's clients who had become friends. Women from my prenatal class, Mrs. Whitaker from church, who hugged me too long, and whispered that she was praying for healing on all sides, which told me Celeste's version had already reached her. I smiled anyway. That was the strangest part. I poured lemonade. I thanked people for tiny socks and board books. I laughed when Marisol guessed the baby's birth date and deliberately chose 2 weeks late, just to annoy me. From the outside, I looked peaceful, Inside, I was counting exits, cameras, witnesses, and breaths. And when Celeste's car finally pulled up to the curb, with Piper in the passenger seat and Nolan staring straight ahead from the back, Graham moved beside me without saying a word. Celeste stepped out of the car like she had arrived for a luncheon, not a baby shower. Navy dress, beige heels, pearls at her throat. Her hair was sprayed into place so carefully that even the lake breeze moving down our street could not disturb it. Piper followed her in a pale pink dress that looked too expensive for someone who had been telling half of Vermont she was on the edge of homelessness. Nolan came last, holding a gift bag with blue tissue paper, his eyes fixed somewhere near the porch steps. My mother kissed my cheek in front of everyone. Her lips barely touched my skin. "My beautiful girl," she said loudly enough for Mrs. Whitaker to hear. "I hope today reminds you what family is supposed to mean." Graham's hand found the small of my back. Not possessive. Steady. A quiet signal that I was not standing there alone. For the first hour, Celeste behaved almost perfectly. That was how I knew she was waiting. She admired the flowers. She complimented the cake. She placed one hand on my belly and said, "Juniper is already so loved," with a softness that would have fooled anyone who had not grown up studying the distance between her words and her eyes. Piper drifted through the rooms taking pictures, leaning close to guests, whispering, accepting sympathy in small doses. More than once, I saw someone touch her arm and glance toward me with that careful discomfort people use when they think they know a private family wound. Nolan sat near the window, folding and unfolding the corner of a napkin. Then, just after Marisol started passing out the baby shower cards, Celeste stood near the fireplace and tapped her spoon lightly against a glass. The room turned toward her. She smiled. Not warmly. Publicly. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she began, which meant she had planned every word. "But as a mother, and soon as a grandmother, I believe family moments should also be honest moments." My stomach tightened. Graham did not move. Celeste lifted a manila folder from the side table. I had not seen her bring it in, but of course she had. My mother never arrived without a prop. "There are things happening in this family that have broken my heart," she said, pressing the folder against her chest. "And I cannot keep pretending that selfishness is privacy." The room went still in that hungry, uncomfortable way a room gets when people know they should look away, but do not. Piper lowered her eyes. Nolan closed his. Celeste turned toward me with tears shining perfectly on command. "Maren," she said, "today, in front of the people who love you, I am asking you to do the right thing." And in that moment, I knew the performance had begun. Celeste opened the folder slowly, as if whatever waited inside had wounded her personally. She slid out a few papers and held them against her chest, turning just enough so the room could see there was documentation, though not enough for anyone to read it. That was intentional. My mother understood the power of paper. Most people trust a printed page before they trust a woman being accused in public. "This is not easy for me," she said, her voice trembling in the exact place it needed to. "No mother wants to stand in her daughter's home and say she has forgotten where she came from." Piper made a small sound from the sofa. Not quite a sob. More like a cue. Celeste looked at her, then back at me. "Your sister is facing real hardship, Maren. Real hardship. And you are sitting on jewelry worth more than most people make in years. Jewelry for a baby who cannot wear it, cannot understand it, cannot need it." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the soft click of Marisol's phone as she shifted it in her hand. She stood near the doorway, calm as stone, the screen angled down but connected. Hadley was listening. I knew she was, though I could not hear her breathe. I felt Graham beside me. I felt Juniper move under my ribs, slow and heavy, as if even she understood the air had changed. "The sapphires belong to my daughter," I said. Celeste's face tightened. "Your daughter," she repeated, turning the words into an accusation. "Your daughter, your house, your husband's money, your new family. Do you hear yourself?" A few people looked down. Mrs. Whitaker pressed her fingers to her mouth. Celeste took one step closer. I have spent months trying to handle this privately. I have tried to protect your reputation. I have tried to keep people from knowing how cold you have become." That was the moment I saw her confidence rise too high. Her eyes sharpened, her voice got stronger. She thought the room was with her. "And don't stand there acting like paperwork is sacred," she snapped. "I have handled paperwork in your name plenty of times, Maren. No one had a problem with it when it helped this family." The silence that followed was different. It was not uncomfortable anymore. It was awake. Piper's head lifted fast. Nolan's face went gray. Graham looked up, not at Celeste, but at the small black camera above the bookshelf. Celeste noticed the shift too late. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward her. I only looked at my mother, standing in my living room with her pearls and her folder and her perfect wounded face. Then I said, "What paperwork did you handle in my name?" Celeste's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time that afternoon, she looked less like a grieving mother and more like a woman searching for the exit in a room she had built herself. "I meant family things," she said quickly. "Small things. You're twisting my words." "No," Graham said, his voice low. "The camera got them exactly as you said them." That was when the color left her face. Marisol stepped closer to me without making a scene. Piper stood up so fast her purse slid off her lap. Nolan whispered my mother's name, not as a warning, but as a plea. Even then, he wanted her to stop before stopping became impossible. But Hadley was already moving. Through Marisol's phone, she told Graham not to argue, not to touch the folder, and not to let anyone leave with documents. Graham asked everyone to remain where they were. Mrs. Whittaker began crying quietly near the fireplace. Celeste tried one more time. "She's emotional," my mother said, pointing at my stomach. "She's pregnant, she's confused." And maybe once, years earlier, that sentence would have folded me in half. Maybe I would have apologized just to make the room breathe again. But I was not 17 anymore, standing in a kitchen with an empty cash box. I was a mother now. And whatever fear I still carried belonged behind me, not in front of my daughter. I looked at Celeste and said, "You did not prove I was selfish. You proved you used my name." The police came first, then Detective Rowan Pierce. Then the paper trail widened exactly the way Hadley said it would. The church forms led to bank records. The bank records led to temporary assistance accounts. Those accounts led straight to Piper's failed event business, and nearly $96,000 Celeste had moved, disguised, or explained away under signatures that were not mine. Piper claimed she did not understand where the money came from. Nolan admitted he had suspected something was wrong for more than a year but stayed silent because he didn't want to destroy the family. That sentence destroyed what was left of it. The stress of that day sent me into early labor that night. Juniper arrived small, loud, and furious at the world, which felt fitting. She spent time under careful monitoring, and I spent the first weeks of motherhood learning that healing can happen beside hospital machines, in whispers, in Graham's hand covering mine. Celeste lost the church, her reputation, and eventually her freedom. Piper lost the version of herself that could cry and be rescued. Nolan lost the privilege of calling silence harmless. The sapphire stayed in the bank, waiting for Juniper, untouched by debt or guilt. And I learned something I should have known years before. Family is not the person who demands your sacrifice in public. Family is the person who stands beside you when you finally stop offering it. There is a lesson I carried out of that house, out of that hospital room, and out of the wreckage of the family I thought I was supposed to protect forever. Love should never require you to disappear. For years, I believed being a good daughter meant being easy to take from. I thought kindness meant saying yes before anyone had to ask. I thought strength meant swallowing the hurt, paying the bill, smoothing over the insult, and pretending I did not notice when the people who claimed to love me used my heart like an open door. But real love does not keep score of what it can take from you. Real family does not turn your boundaries into betrayal. Real family does not make you prove your loyalty by handing over your peace, your safety, your marriage, or your child's future. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that the people who raised you can still be the people you need protection from. That does not make you cruel. It does not make you ungrateful. It means you finally understand that forgiveness without boundaries is just another way to stay trapped. I learned that silence can be dangerous when it protects the wrong person. I learned that peace built on fear is not peace at all. And I learned that becoming a mother did not make me softer in the way my family expected. It made me clearer. It made me braver. It made me unwilling to pass old pain down to a child who deserved a cleaner kind of love. Juniper will grow up knowing that family is not defined by who demands the most from you. Family is defined by who stands beside you when life is heavy, who protects your name when you are not in the room, and who respects your no without making you pay for it. So, if this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved? Do you think I did the right thing by walking away completely? And if you believe stories like this matter, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so we can keep sharing the truth together.